Thank you so much, everybody. This next song is off of our upcoming EP. It's the titular track. It's called 1980,000. We're gonna take you there right now. much, everybody. Hey, I've actually never heard that before with this band. Yeah. Hey. You know, only in Cincinnati, Ohio, guys. It's a magical place. We're glad to be here. Thank you to Urban Artifact for having us. We got some more tunes, a few more tunes, a couple more tunes to play. Thanks to Devin for doing a fabulous sound job, and Michael back there too. You know, can't do it without you guys. Alright guys, once again, this is Luke Bergamini on the bass. Give him a round of applause, come on. He's working very hard up there. And wearing very short shorts. We have Willis Edmonton on the drums. Ben Hammer on the keys. My name's Graham Bloom, I play guitar and I do a little singing. This song is called Not Basketball.
Welcome to Science on Tap Cincinnati. We do this monthly educational science program where we bring together people that want to have curious minds and want to learn more to talk about fun and interesting topics. So thank you all for coming out tonight. If you're not already connected with us, we are on Facebook on Science on Tap Cincinnati. We are also on Meetup. You can also follow us at Urban Artifact or Radio Artifact. They are our amazing partners that help all of this come together, and we appreciate them. So tonight's topic is the Mediterranean diet. So for those that are going to be celebrating Mardi Gras soon, you can plan for after. I'm really looking forward to this talk to see the evidence behind the diet and learn more about it. And so grateful for Florence Rothenberg for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I am thrilled to be here. My name is Florence Rothenberg. I'm a cardiologist, and I've been in Cincinnati since 2006. And I am now a Northsider. I've been one for the last year and a half, and I'm thrilled to be here. Love this neighborhood. One of the things that brought me to this neighborhood, and I'll tell you some of the story as we go on, was my frustration in that I care for veterans, and I have seen over the years in my medical practice that my patients who have access to good food, healthy food, and exercise are much more resilient to illness and stress than my patients who don't have such access. And there's a whole broad range of reasons why people struggle with healthy eating and exercise. And my goal in Northside is to address those obstacles and figure out how to mitigate them. And so the Mediterranean diet is near and dear to me, and I hope to present not just the science behind it, but a little bit about science and what science means to me. This is my new home. You probably recognize this. This is the Old North Church on Hamilton Avenue. I bought it, and the reason why I bought it is my goal is to build a rooftop farm on the 4,000 square foot flat roof on the education building. And we also have events, but I don't want to step on anybody's toes here. We have weddings too, but that kind of thing. But that's the reason why I bought this property, is to grow healthy food in the community and address the obstacles to healthy eating. So what is science? I realized today I actually did the math on how long I've been in science and medicine, and it's a little embarrassing, but I've been doing this a long time. I'm going to present to you what I think science is. There's tons of definitions out there. This is my conglomeration of what it means from all the work that I've done over the years. And to me, science is a rigorous approach to figure out how something works and then testing whether your understanding is true or not. And in medicine, science identifies whether a new treatment is effective in reducing disease and what other risks and benefits of that treatment may be. And I'll tell you how that works. That's what the scientific approach does. So I kind of color-coded the slides a little bit in the different categories of how we look at science. There's three components. There's observation, then you create a hypothesis based on your observation, and then you test it. So you describe what you see. That's what observation is. So in the early 1900s, it was very obvious that American men were dying very young from cardiovascular disease. And they were dying in their 50s at very high numbers from strokes and heart attacks, and they didn't know why. There was one observation that was made that heart attack rates in the Japanese men who moved to America were much higher than Japanese men who were living in Hawaii versus Japanese men who lived in Japan. And so the belief was, or the hypothesis that was generated from the observation, was that the data indicates that there is something that the American lifestyle, some component of the American lifestyle that increases the risk of having heart attacks and strokes in men. So what was that? Then you want to test the hypothesis. So the randomized control trial is the gold standard for testing whether a treatment works or not in medicine. Ideally, you have two identical groups, two groups who are at the same exact risk. One group gets the experimental intervention, and the other group gets a control, a placebo. And then you compare the outcome over time. And you have to recruit patients who are at risk for that particular problem to make it easier. If you have a group of patients who are not at risk, then you're going to be waiting a long time before they might have that outcome. But if you have a group of patients who are at risk for heart attacks, then you have a much shorter duration before you have to wait, which is a little gruesome, but that's how we think about it. So we recruit a high-risk population. We have what's called inclusion and exclusion criteria in studies. And what that means is the inclusion criteria is, for example, if you're doing a study on hypertension, you want to enroll people who have hypertension. So that is an inclusion criteria. And an exclusion criteria might be something like they're allergic to the medication or some component of the medication. So that every study that we do has a list of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And in the news reports, when you see things like hot dogs reduce your risk, your mortality by a year for every hot dog you eat, and there was something like this in the literature, I'm just paraphrasing, it was ridiculous. It was a mathematical model. It wasn't based on any population. So you always have to ask, who is this tested in? Is it the right group? Are they asking the right questions? So not everything you see in the news, you have to look at the population they were testing. Then the randomized controlled trial includes randomization. What is that? So you take this high-risk group of people and you pick the first person out, you have a randomization algorithm that puts them into one group or the other. And you go through the group of people and they get randomized into each group. And what that does is it should, at the end of the day, give you two groups of people that are identical in terms of risk. So that when you apply your treatment or the control, you know that there's no difference in the risk of each group. So that's why we randomize. And the reason why we've decided to do randomization is because sometimes doctors really like a patient and say, I really like this person, I want them to go into the treatment group. Well, then they're not randomized, and you may end up subconsciously putting a whole bunch of people who are at higher risk in one group or lower risk in one group than the other. So the randomization mitigates the risk of your introducing bias into the study. And a control is, as I was mentioning earlier, a placebo control is an inert substance that looks like the experimental intervention, but it may or may not, well, that's a whole other story. So the placebo looks like it's an inert substance that looks like the intervention, and that's to be able to understand the risks and the benefits of the experimental treatment. So when you have an inert substance, then for example, you have a new substance that you're testing and then a placebo, and you see in the placebo group, 20% of the people get indigestion, but 20% of the people in the experimental group do as well. Then you know that it's not necessarily the experimental treatment that's causing it, but if you saw a much higher or lower incidence of heartburn, then you would know that it may be related to that intervention. And then blinding. So blinding refers to the patient and the treater and the treating physician or group not knowing if the patient is getting the intervention or the control. And that's important because there's oftentimes so if a patient thinks that they're getting an intervention, then they might engage in healthier behaviors because they know they're getting the more expensive, fancy medication. Whereas a patient who's getting a control might feel disappointed and say, they don't care about me, I'm just going to smoke more cigarettes or something. And this actually happens. My mom was in a study years and years ago. She was in a study for atrial fibrillation, so all the people in the group had to have atrial fibrillation, so that was the inclusion criteria. And they could not have allergies to that medication. I remember her telling me years ago, we're from New York, so she said, Florrie, I don't think I'm in the treatment group because I don't feel any different. So she was disappointed at being in the control group. It turns out that being in the control group had a much lower mortality rate. So she was actually in the right group, but she felt disappointed. And so that might cause people to engage in different behaviors if they know that they're in one group or the other. So it could influence the outcome. The other thing that people forget is that you have to duplicate this result. It's not good enough to show it once. You have to show it over and over and over again, ideally in different populations, different cultures, you want to support the fact that this treatment is going to do good for everyone. It strengthens the findings, and it demonstrates generalizability of the effect. It's very nice. It's very nice to be the first one to prove something, but it's very important to not just prove it, but to show that it works in other populations as well. And we have a bias in our literature even. There are oftentimes journals that refuse to publish data that already proves a hypothesis. But I think that's silly because we have to show that it's generalizable. So I think I have my own biases too. So what is bias? Why is all of this necessary? And that is to mitigate bias because we all have it. What is it? Biases are assumptions or beliefs about how the world works that are not necessarily based on strong evidence. So, for example, you see a person that does something, you think that all people that look like that person are going to do whatever that person did. It's some evidence, but it's not strong evidence, and it's a bias. It brings us farther from the truth, from reality. So we already know that scientists know that this is normal. It's built into our brain stems to help us avoid danger and to feel belonging in certain situations. So it creates patterns that we expect or look for to feel comfortable or to know that we need to run when we need to run. But it's not necessarily true. So all of these methods that I've been telling you about are designed to mitigate this bias and to bring us close to the truth and to find out if this intervention is really benefiting us or not. Diet studies are fraught with difficulties. We see a lot in the literature now about this diet or that diet, but they are fraught with difficulties. And the major one and the most obvious difficulty is that people know what they're eating. You can't blind the experiment because you know what meal you're eating. So that makes it difficult in terms of eliminating bias from studies. So I'll start with that because that is the most important and difficult problem that we face in looking at what the healthiest diet might be. So how do we determine what the healthiest diet is? I can't talk enough about Ansel Keys. Nobody knows who he is, but he is one of the most remarkable people I've ever read about. He was born in 1904, died in 2004, lived 100 years. Did anybody know what the K ration is? Somebody said, yeah. Yes, he invented it. Did you know that? Oh, awesome. Hi. You were hiding behind a pole. Yeah, so Ansel Keys, that's the K is for Ansel Keys. He invented the K ration. He was fascinated by nutrition and health and really motivated by World War II. And so he invented the K ration because they needed to have a nutrition-dense food that soldiers could carry with them anywhere. And that would maintain and remain stable over time. So he invented the K ration. And then when the war was ending, he became fascinated by the refeeding phenomenon in that people who were starving, which was people all over Europe, were starving. When you refed them, many of them died. And so he was fascinated by this whole process of food and health and nutrition. And he observed, because he was also very well traveled and traveled the world, he observed that in different cultures, he and his wife had visited Naples, Italy, and observed that men were not dying from heart attacks and strokes like they were in the United States. And he was fascinated by this. So he created the 7-country study, which was started in 1957. And basically, the countries are really tiny, but it's something like the Netherlands, US, Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, Japan, and I'm missing one. If anybody can read the little, they're tiny. But anyway, 7 countries. And so he had people in different cities in those countries analyzing cholesterol, hypertension, or blood pressure, weight, all of these things, and then looked at mortality over time and found that the Mediterranean diet was associated with longest lifestyle, with the longest life and fewest illness, or least illness. And so he and his wife actually published this book in the 1970s, and it's out of print, and so you can't get it, but it's on Amazon. And How to Eat Well and Stay Well, the Mediterranean Way. So he and his wife published this in 1975, and he lived to 2004. And he was interviewed on his 100th birthday. And this is a quote from this article that I have. Ever the rigorous scientist, when asked on his 100th birthday whether his diet had contributed to his long life, he answered, very likely, but no proof. Because there wasn't proof. As I pointed out, it was just observation at that point. They hadn't tested it yet. So now we're going to talk about what the diet is, and then we're going to talk about the tests, how they tested this diet. The Mediterranean diet, I love this picture. I just got this online. You can probably just Google it, and it's there. What this image points out is that the Mediterranean diet really rests on a foundation of community. And we forget about that. Community is being together, eating together, living together, helping each other, exercising together. But the whole diet rests on this foundation. The major component of the diet is, of course, fresh fruits, vegetables, whole grains, Olive oil, beans, nuts, legumes, seeds, herbs, and spices. And actually, yeah, the major components, or the magic ingredients, if you will, are considered to be the plant-based foods, the fresh produce and legumes, and also monounsaturated fats from extra virgin olive oil and nuts. So those are the magic ingredients to the Mediterranean diet. And you should eat the most of those. That's why they're the base of the pyramid. And then on top of that is protein from poultry, primarily from seafood, fish and seafood. And then dairy products and poultry, you can have some of that. And at the very tippy top is meats and sweets. So red meat and sweets are not excluded. And then there's wine and water as part of the diet too. I could talk for days about alcohol and its role in health too. The jury's out. I don't know. I'm having a rosé. There you go. But the important thing to know about this is that there's no in it. Everything is okay. It's just more of the healthy stuff and less of the unhealthy stuff. No guilt, no measuring. There's not a scale on here. Nothing like that. So it's really a lifestyle. So the hypothesis is people who live the Mediterranean lifestyle have fewer heart attacks and strokes. That's the hypothesis. Now we have to test it. So here's the randomized control trial. As I mentioned, we recruit a high-risk population. We randomize them to each group. We control for it, so we have a diet that is not Mediterranean diet. And then we blind it. So ideally, both the patient and the person doing the study should not know what diet that person's getting, but obviously they're going to know what they're eating. Can't get around that. The data on the Mediterranean diet is pretty strong, but it's largely observational, and almost all of those studies are positive in that they show reduced heart attacks or strokes. But there's only 3 major randomized controlled trials with the largest number of patients so far. And there's the Predimed diet, which I'm going to talk about. That's primary prevention. Primary prevention means we are keeping you from having a first heart attack or stroke. You've never had one, you're not going to get one. Secondary prevention, which is the Lyon Heart Study, Diet Study, and CardioPrev, are secondary prevention studies, and those are, I have had a heart attack or stroke and I don't want to have another one. I'm not going to talk about the Lyon study because that was published in 1994. And that was before a lot of our modern treatments were developed, so I'm going to leave that one out. It was positive, it was strongly positive, but I don't think it's really relevant today. So the Predimed study, this slide is just to show you that yes, we had high-risk people. We had men and women who were older, who were at higher risk for heart attacks and strokes. This whole study was done across the entire country of Spain. It was a multi-center trial, but within Spain. The patients, none of them had a stroke or heart attack. And they all had type 2 diabetes mellitus, or they were smokers, they had hypertension, elevated LDL, high bad cholesterol or low good cholesterol. They were overweight or obese, and they had a family history of premature heart disease. They had to have at least 3 of these items. So it was a higher risk group. Don't be bothered by this. This slide is just because I want you to know every randomized controlled trial should have this as their first figure. It should be a diagram that shows you all of the patients, what their risk factors were, and it should show you that there was equal risk in both groups. And this chart shows that. These are the characteristics. They had 2 different Mediterranean diets. They had one that was supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, and then they had another group that was supplemented with nuts. And then the control diet was a low-fat diet. It was basically, if you go to American Heart Association low-fat diet, which was what they recommended a couple years ago, that's pretty much what that diet was. And this was a huge study. They had 2,500 people in each group, so it was really huge. The other thing that's really important about this study is the gender separation or division reflected society. There were about 55% of the enrollees were women, which is incredible. We consider a study with 20% women good, which is kind of embarrassing. Why that is, I don't know. But they actually had a representative number of women in this trial. Unfortunately, it was mainly white people in this study. So those are the goods and the bads. Each group was at exactly the same risk. There was no difference in risk between the groups, so yay. And this is just to tell you that they were all high risk. Most were on medications for lipids or blood pressure. They actually followed adherence over time. So they used questionnaires, and this is one of the problems with diet studies. The adherence is followed with diaries and questionnaires, so it's reliant on memory. And a lot of times people don't remember what they ate very well or aren't as good about writing things down and that kind of stuff. So that's one of the problems with diet studies. But this study was unique, the Predimed study, in that they also measured plasma levels to make sure people had adequate nut intake and urine levels to make sure they had adequate olive oil intake. So they actually followed these. They did random samples on people in the diet. There was no caloric restriction. That's important. And then this is also important. Nuts and olive oil were provided, and this was a potential conflict of interest because some of the people who were performing this study had stock in the companies that provided the nuts and olive oil. So, yeah, a little bit of conflict of interest there. So this is the primary result that they had. The primary endpoint, which is what they're looking for, why they designed the whole study, is based on the primary endpoint. And they were looking at a composite of heart attacks, myocardial infarction, stroke, and death from cardiovascular causes. And this is the actual raw data, and they kind of squish it and stretch it so that you can see. It's not really a manipulation of the data, it's just helping you see the outcome better. And you see that the control diet, people on the control diet had a higher number of heart attacks, strokes, and death from cardiovascular causes than the people who were on the either Mediterranean diet at the end of 5 years. So they followed out 5 years. And this was a significant difference. The other thing I want to point out is that these curves split really early on. So they saw an effect very early after starting the diet. And that's powerful to me. So it seems like the Mediterranean diet does impact the cardiovascular events. Don't worry about this. I'm going to go over it really carefully, but this is the numbers. If you're a numbers person, this is your graph. What they do is they divide out the strokes, number of patients with myocardial infarction, and the number of patients who died from cardiovascular causes. And then they have the Mediterranean diet with olive oil, nuts, and control. And I always start from the control panel because that tells me what the baseline is that we have to do better than. So 58 people on the control diet had stroke, but 32 people on the Mediterranean diet with nuts had a stroke versus 49 with the extra virgin olive oil. That's a significant difference in both of these groups. That's awesome. Myocardial infarction, 38, 31, and 37, not so much. So that actually is not a significant difference. And death from cardiovascular causes was 30, 31, and 26, not really a difference there. So the events that were reduced were primarily related to stroke outcomes, which is also very interesting. So some of the biases that they couldn't control for, it wasn't blinded, but they followed adherence through the diaries and the blood and urine levels. They had some randomization problems. If you guys go back and look in the original literature, you'll find that originally they randomized families. So if they had several people in a family that were eligible for the study, they put the whole family on the same diet, which is not really good because maybe the whole family has a genetic predisposition towards stroke or not stroke or something of that nature. So they actually went back and reanalyzed the data, taking all those people out, and they had a stronger result. So by fixing that, if you see this in the papers, they actually had a better result when they fixed all those problems. And then the financial conflict that I was talking about. So it's a nice result because they had a large number of people. They had gender parity. It was nicely controlled, but still problematic. And I'm kind of a data nerd. There's a group of even more nerdy people, and it's a Cochrane group. It's a nonprofit that's based in the United Kingdom. And it's a group of people that just obsess over the quality of research data. And they consider this, based on a lot of algorithms that they have, this is considered low to moderate quality data. And this is some of the best data that we have. So that should tell you how hard it is to do diet studies. So don't believe everything that you see on TV and in the news. So I talked about primary versus secondary prevention. That was preventing a first stroke or heart attack. Now we want to see if this is going to be effective in people who have had a stroke or heart attack. Yeah, I pretty much said all that. This is the CardioPrev diet study. This was published in 22, so 2 years ago now. This was also done in Spain. It's a single center study, so it was only done out of one university in Spain. What I want to point out from this slide, this is that big table one that I said every randomized control study should have to show that all of the groups had the same exact risk, which they did. But what I want to point out is that there were many fewer women. And it was a much smaller study. They only had 500 people in each group, and 20% were women. So it was a good study, but only 20% were women. But otherwise, the groups were exactly the same in terms of risk, except for one thing: history of prior malignancy. So if you have death as an endpoint in your study, you want to make sure that people aren't dying from something else. And so you always just check and make sure that you have the same degree of cancer or some other potentially life-threatening illness in the group. And they found that actually there was a higher number of patients with prior malignancy in the Mediterranean diet group, and that was statistically significant, but not clinically significant, most likely. So otherwise, they were very similar. And their composite endpoint was pretty similar. Myocardial infarction, they included revascularization. So in someone who has had coronary disease or stroke or vascular disease in the arms or legs, you guys have heard of stents and that sort of thing, or bypasses. Revascularization means putting in a stent and opening up the flow, or putting in a bypass. That's what revascularization is. And they reserve that for people who are at risk of having a heart attack, having a stroke, or having worsening disease, symptomatic disease. So it's reserved for people who are going to have problems from this blockage. So revascularization was in this stroke and documented peripheral arterial disease and cardiovascular death. And this was a 7-year study, so it was very long. And this is the overall graph from this. And the top panel is what I want you to focus on. This is all of the patients in this study, men and women. And you can see that the patients who were on the low-fat diet at the end of 7 years had a much higher incidence of the composite endpoint than people who were on the Mediterranean diet. Interestingly, it didn't start separating until the second year. So these are people who are at much higher risk. So the separation was a lot later. The other thing that was interesting is that women had no benefit from this diet. There was no harm, but there was no benefit. So when they took out the women from the group, you can see that it was a much more dramatic effect. So they excluded women in this panel here. So the benefit of the Mediterranean diet in these two randomized controlled studies, which are the only large-scale studies that we have for any diet looking at cardiovascular endpoints, we see that the Mediterranean diet improves outcomes in primary prevention. And this was a study with 7,000 patients, but from one country. And then in secondary prevention, preventing you from having another event, it seems to show benefit. But this was a much smaller study, single site, same country. So we really don't have a whole lot of data, but this is what we've got. This is the best data we have. So I go back to green. I forgot to tell you I color-coded this. Green is hypothesis generating. This study causes us to ask a lot more questions. Why, for example, why were there not fewer heart attacks in the primary prevention group. Remember, in the Predimed study, they had mostly the benefit was in terms of stroke, not heart attacks. And these are all my thoughts from my understanding of the literature from reading a lot of this stuff. All of these studies were done in Spain, where they already adopt a Mediterranean lifestyle. And I'm guessing that perhaps the general population is at lower risk in general because maybe they exercise more, maybe they eat better. But I'm just guessing. So maybe that if it was a higher risk group, you would see an impact on cardiac, myocardial infarctions as well. Yeah, and that's pretty much what I say. Why is there less benefit for women in secondary prevention? Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is there weren't enough women in the sample, and it's very likely that all the women that they picked were at lower risk for having an event anyway. So maybe they weren't likely to have an outcome in that time period, so you didn't see a benefit. It turns out that women develop heart disease and have heart attacks about 10 years later than men do. They actually didn't tell you how that broke down in terms of age for the women. They didn't tell you if they enrolled women who were postmenopausal, how far out from menopause were they on hormone replacement therapy. They didn't mention that in the trial. So it's possible that they enrolled women who are at low risk for having an event anyway. So those are all hypothesis generating thoughts. Yeah, and actually that's the end of my talk. So we see a benefit from the Mediterranean diet. I prescribe it all of the time because there is no harm. It's easy to do. People love it. It tastes good. There's no guilt. There's no. You don't have to weigh anything. And that's what I'm going to be promoting unless someone finds something else better over time. So with that, do you have any questions for me? Yes.
What role would exercise have in that?
They actually did not study that, and they gave no direction, and they made a point of saying we did not advise on exercise at all. But obviously in the community portion, it's very important. Exercise is not going to help you lose weight, but it's going to help reduce outcomes over time. You actually do have cardiovascular benefit from more exercise. You sleep better. Yeah, so exercise and it keeps your tone, your muscle tone. So I also recommend that, but it's not part of these studies. Yes.
I'm curious the separation between the olive oil and the nuts. So in that study, were they only on that could not eat nuts?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So they didn't say not to eat them, but they supplemented them. So they got them for free. And they encouraged them to have, I think it was 3 servings a week of nuts if they were given the nuts. And the olive oil, they were given the olive oil free and encouraged to have, I think it's something like, it was a huge amount of olive oil, way more than we even think of eating in our diets. But they didn't discourage them from eating them. Yeah, good question.
Okay, we have a mic for questions.
So I noticed that the hypothesis specifically called out the Mediterranean lifestyle, but it sounds like they weren't given any instructions around physical activity, right?
Right.
Were they
right.
documenting any information about participants who were physically active or any of the other lifestyle factors like community as a part of the study, or was it primarily focused on the diet?
Also good. Actually, they're all good questions. So always they will have a supplemental packet that comes with the main paper that tells you all of the things that they did. And I didn't see anything regarding exercise. They had the recipes, they had the breakdown of the food that people ate. They actually saw an increase in fat in the Mediterranean diets from olive oil and nuts. But they didn't break down exercise in either study, which I thought was interesting. They also didn't talk about the women's age and if they were on hormone replacement therapy, which has a significant impact on women's cardiovascular events. So there was a lot that they did not mention.
what kind of effect on diabetic patients does the Mediterranean diet have, since it's all simple sugars or natural sugars? Would that work for people that have prediabetes or diabetes? And if not, why?
Yeah, so the Predamid diet, the patients who were enrolled had to have type 2 diabetes or from the list. And I can't remember offhand, and it's probably in the slide actually. Let me see how many people had type 2 diabetes. They did see overall weight loss, and they saw reduced blood pressure in the groups and the more adherent you were, the more of a benefit you saw in those areas. I don't know that they talked about necessarily, oh wait, I went past it twice now. Come on. Here we go. Smoking, racial, type 2 diabetes, 50% in all of the groups. So they had half of the patients had diabetes, and they saw the same benefit in the diabetic group, but they didn't talk per se about impact on glucose, hemoglobin A1C, or anything like that. But I know that there is benefit from other studies, other smaller studies.
I have a question about the nuts. Are there a couple of nuts that are like your top choices for,
So they actually studied, good question too, they studied hazelnuts, walnuts, and almonds. Those were the nuts that they provided. There is belief that it doesn't really matter, but those particular three are high protein and high fiber and lower in fat than something like a cashew or a peanut. So if I had a mix, I wouldn't reject the cashews or peanuts.
Okay,
I would eat them all.
Of course, cashews are my favorite.
Yes.
And then I had looked into the Mediterranean diet about a year ago, and I found that pyramid, but I'm kind of a recipe person. So you think I should just keep trying to find websites? I mean, I think I would cook more fish and incorporate more of the vegetables and stuff, but I just need recipes. Do you have any advice?
There are tons of really great recipe books. One of the things, too, that I'm seeing is more cultural adaptations for diets that incorporate Mediterranean components. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to eat hummus all day long, in other words. Or grape leaf things, you don't have to eat those all day. So we're trying to figure out cultural adaptations and also adaptations for different ethnic recipes or different things that you might grow. So there's a lot of work going on to adapt it to people's different taste profiles. And actually we're working on that too. My son is a chef, and we both bought the multi-cookers. He's going to try to create recipes, and I'm going to try to duplicate what he does. So we're trying to create recipes that are easy, that anybody can make, and create recipe books. But there's a ton out there and more all the time. Yeah, actually the American Heart Association just put out a African American cookbook that incorporates a lot of the Mediterranean diet advice. Sure.
Could you re-describe those diets? Were they, you said they were high-quality diet, or not diets, the studies.
Oh,
Did you say they were high-quality studies because of the number, or because they were examples of studies that had been done on the Mediterranean diet? Because it surprised me that there are only 3 good comprehensive studies.
Yes, because they're really hard to do. So you have to isolate a high-risk group. You have to make sure that they're going to stay on the diet and encourage them to eat a lot of those foods in the course of a day and not cheat. And there's just a whole lot of, they're very difficult studies to do. That's why we don't have that many of them.
And so there aren't, I mean, you'd think that everybody in
You
the
would.
world would want to know this.
Yes.
And countries would want to pay for it, and
Yeah.
researchers would want to pay for it, marketers would want to pay for it. Everybody would want to know, so why
So
aren't there more?
my cynical conspiracy theory brain says it's not a pill and it's not, you can grow it in your backyard. Why would they want you to know that you can be healthy with stuff you can grow yourself?
Well, it could save insurance companies a lot of money.
Yeah, well, but they also want to make money too, right? And and hospitals, actually hospitals too, make a lot of money from bypasses. They don't reimburse for prevention. We live in a disease model health system where the hospitals make money from procedures. They don't make it if you're not sick. And they don't make it if I spend 45 minutes telling you how to stay healthy, I can't bill a high, I bill very low for that. I won't make a lot of money for my hospital for doing that. So I'm not encouraged necessarily to do that, which is awful. And you would think that this would be, everybody would want to know. That's why I'm telling you, because I think you should know this. Yeah, this is super important. The other point I want to make too is that the diets that you read about in newspapers are based on tiny numbers, and they're oftentimes not controlled. They don't have these rigorous features built into those studies. And so really think about what you're seeing in the literature. So there's the keto diet, and there's this diet, and then that diet. They might make you feel good, but there's no data showing that you're going to have fewer heart attacks for being on them. And in fact, the keto diet, there's evidence coming out now that's suggesting that there's not a cardiovascular benefit from a keto diet. So you might feel better, but it won't prevent you from having a heart attack or stroke.
So being neither a statistician nor a clinician, I found it interesting that at one point when you were discussing some of the data, you said, well, this is statistically important but not clinically important. Can you explain what that means?
Oh, yeah. Where did I talk about that? Oh, yeah. That was in the, there was a statistical difference in people with prior malignancy in each of the groups in the CardioPrev study. But it didn't have an impact on the overall clinical result of this study. So statistically, it was relevant in that one group potentially had a higher risk of dying in a shorter period of time. But it didn't have an impact on the overall result. So for example, I might do a study on a blood pressure medicine and see that there was a 1 millimeter of mercury difference in the treatment group, statistically 1 millimeter. So it's statistically significant difference, but a 1 millimeter of mercury difference is not going to have a clinical benefit. Actually, you do see one with maybe 3 millimeters. Very small improvement in blood pressure will improve outcomes, but 1 millimeter, not so much. So if you may statistically see a difference in the two groups, but clinically you won't see an outcome in terms of benefits. Did that make sense? Awesome.
Hi. Could you comment on the Mediterranean diet versus blue zones, which I know a lot of those people are living with in countries where the diet would be sort of frowned upon based on this study, but they seem to be living long lives. So is there a way to reconcile
So
all
yes, I
that?
can comment, but I'm going to say that I don't know anything about the blue zone diet. Sorry. I think that there's a lot of overlap in countries that have more longevity and also encourage a Mediterranean lifestyle. I think a lot of those blue zone countries have a lot of community, eating together, exercising, moving around. But beyond that, I don't know if there's a difference in the diets per se. But I do think there's a lot of overlap in the Mediterranean lifestyle and blue zone outcomes. And that blue zone, I think that's where they live longer. Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of overlap, but I don't know that literature really well. Sure. Do you know more about what countries?
I know there are pockets in Italy where
Pockets in Italy.
there are other countries that you wouldn't necessarily consider Mediterranean lifestyle.
I was thinking Japan myself.
Japan.
Yeah.
So there is overlap. So
There's
Japan
overlap.
and Italy were better outcomes. Yeah. And the Japanese diet is, so we've identified the Mediterranean lifestyle with Italian kinds of foods and Mediterranean kinds of foods, but the Japanese diet is also high in fish and fruits and vegetables and low in red meat. So it's not too dissimilar. There's not much in the way of nuts or dairy and that kind of thing. Community, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I bought the Old North Church, because it already has community built in. And I'm just sort of fanning the flames and letting it grow and having lots of community events. We're hoping to grow food on the roof. So the goal is to create a Mediterranean lifestyle in Northside. That's what I hope to do. Oh man, you got 2 million? I can start like soon. So Jason, actually here, Jason Schneider is my architect. He's helped me create the design for the roof and the kitchen. So we're developing a teaching kitchen also. So we now know that I'm going to need 2.5 million to build those. And so as soon as I get that money, I can get started. I'm already getting started on for example, improving health literacy. That's one of my goals. I'm utilizing the farmers market. I'm going to be developing a blood pressure identification and education program in the farmers market. I didn't mention this. I don't know how much time we have. I could talk forever about this, as you've probably noticed. There's a study called the Barbershop Trial, which is a big inspiration for me. And that was a study done in LA, published 2018. And basically, they used black barbershops in black neighborhoods as places to teach people about hypertension. And they had people like the barber who did the blood pressures, did the teaching, so trusted members of the community. And then they had black pharmacists create treatment protocols that were culturally acceptable for the community, because there are some medications that people were mistrustful of. And so using this protocol, they found a 22 millimeter mercury improvement in blood pressure in the groups that participated in the barbershop, which is insane. They actually got the blood pressure under control in those groups. The study was over at 6 months, but they followed 6 months later and found that at 12 months, the blood pressure was still well controlled. So there is an incredible power to using the community to improve health outcomes. So I'm starting that in the farmers market. My goal is to try to bleed into all of the businesses and just have everybody be aware, measuring blood pressure, literature, health literacy, providing food, getting the blood pressure down. And my son's a chef. He's creating a line of no salt and low salt seasonings. So to eliminate salt as much as possible from people who have hypertension. I could talk for days on salt, whole other story. So the goal is to get embedded in the community, a sense of health being part of everything that we do. So it's easy. It should be easy. They had 95% retention in the barbershop trial, which is nuts. You just don't see that in any other study, and it's because people are going to the same place that they're always going to go to get health advice, and it just makes so much sense. So that's the kind of thing that I want to figure out how to do here, and then make a roadmap for other communities to do that. So if you know anybody with 2.5 million, let me know, and we'll get this knocked right out.
I have a couple more quick little questions that I thought of. So
I could do this all day.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so what was the name of the group? I think you said they were in Europe that scrutinizes the studies.
The Cochrane
They
group.
love the number. Oh, Cochrane.
The Cochrane group.
Cochrane. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then in the picture of the church that you bought, do you also own the adjacent building? That's where you're going to think about.
I will show you the whole.
They kind of look like they were a package deal.
Yeah, it was. It's huge.
And then is your son here?
Yeah.
Is he going to open
lives
up
in
Mediterranean
Clifton.
restaurant in Northside?
He lives in
hopefully?
Clifton.
In Clifton?
I'm not sure. He's actually getting a post-chef degree in food science. So I'm hoping that he'll work with me and keep in upcycling food and figuring out a map to food use and waste and all that. But I own all of this. The flat top building, yeah. And in this building, that has an event center, and it has the commercial kitchen right there, and it has, I actually am housing a couple of small businesses. So we have an herbalist there, a grief counselor, and adventure crew. Everybody here probably knows Libby Hunter. She's with Adventure Crew now, and they're renting a space with me as well. And I just partnered with a group called Brick Gardens, and Dominique Peebles owns that. And it's a nonprofit whose goal is to take old buildings and turn them into urban agriculture. He's got 5 farms across Cincinnati now, and he's building out a hydroponics room now. And once we get the funding for the rooftop farm, he's going to help me with that as well. But yeah, so he's been doing that now for 5 years, I think. We also, his other business, Caps and Trade, they're growing mushrooms in there too. So we have a little tents with mushrooms growing. It's really kind of fun. And then in the sanctuary, we're having events. Young professionals, Choral Collective has done events there. I now have a couple of musical entrepreneurs doing music therapy and having a regular chorus. Who else is in there? I have Improv actually rents, because their theater is really tiny, so they have rented out like eight classes a week they do in my place. Yeah, so it's hopping. It's really busy. CCM actually, they were there today. CCM is using the organ, so yeah, I'm really excited about that. I inherited the organ that's in the sanctuary. And so CCM, their students come and play on Tuesdays. And the first Wednesday of every month at the farmer's market, they do a little concert. So they were there today, and it was awesome. So the students have to learn they give a little talk about the piece that they're going to play. And then they play it. And it's awesome. And Dr. Michael Unger, who is the chairman of the Department of Organ and Harpsichord Music at CCM, comes and he grades them. And he's such a delightful person. So if you're around on the first Monday, we're doing them at 4 now because of the student schedules. We're trying for later so we get more people coming. But so it's hopping. We're doing a lot. We're trying to use every inch of the place. Any other questions? I can't believe I did that in under an hour. Yeah.
Does the Mediterranean diet assume, because vegetables and nuts are up at the top, does it automatically assume that there's a lot of fiber in the diet?
Oh, fiber is really critical. Fiber is essential. And that's one of the reasons why nuts are probably so helpful, is that they're tons of fiber and protein in a small package. So you feel full quicker with less calories. So is your question about fiber? That absolutely is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing something, the full plate living diet, heard of that, which is full plate living, which has a very heavy emphasis, mostly emphasizes fiber and making sure you have lots and lots of fiber on your plate. And you can keep eating whatever you want to, but try to make the bad stuff smaller and smaller, try to make the fiber bigger and bigger. So a lot of it has to do with learning which foods have more fiber and which ones have more moisture or water in them.
Right.
Which is necessary with fiber. And then, well, that's mainly what it is, learning about nuts, learning about legumes, learning about grains.
Yep.
And everything else.
And whole grains.
Yes, whole grains.
Yeah, whole grains. So the grain, I actually have this really great picture that shows you what a whole grain is. It's basically a seed, and there's the bran, which is the fiber. Then there's the germ, which is what the embryo eats. So there's the embryo in the middle, the germ, and that's all the fat stuff and the refined stuff. And what refining the whole wheat does is it takes the bran off. So you're getting all of the fat and none of the fiber. So whole wheat just means that they leave the bran on the outside, and that's why whole wheat's better. But yeah, no, I'm a big fan of fiber. I think that's super important. It's also good for gut health. There's some data showing improved microbiome and that sort of thing with more fiber. So I think that's definitely a part of it.
Fiber feeds the microbiome. It doesn't necessarily feed us, although whatever has fiber in it often has vitamins and minerals and other nutrients that we do need. But the fiber itself, what I have read, is that it doesn't really feed us. It feeds the microbia in the gut
Yes,
and then allows it or enables it to do exactly what it's supposed to do.
yes.
Is process everything properly and let the good stuff come in and get rid of the bad stuff.
I agree. I don't know that we know for sure. The other thing I want to mention too, and I should mention veganism. I'm surprised I didn't get a question on that, which is the exclusion of all animal products. There hasn't been a study like this for veganism where they randomized, controlled, blinded, all that kind of thing. But observational studies suggest that you do have, and this is interesting and we don't know why, fewer heart attacks, but more strokes in people who are more adherent to vegan diets. We don't know why. We think it's related to B12 deficiency because B12 is in meat and animal products and you don't get it from a vegan diet. So we always recommend, if you're going to go more vegan, to take B12 supplements. But there's a lot that we don't really understand about that. And there hasn't been this kind of a study for vegan diets.
Could that be related to tofu by chance? Because isn't it high quantities of tofu could actually lead to brain deterioration?
I have not seen that in the literature.
Okay, I thought I read that several years ago.
Where'd
but
you
it
read
has
it?
to be.
Where'd you
well,
read it? And what population?
It was 10 years ago when I was a psychology major. So
Yeah,
it was just,
yeah.
You know, it was probably one of my neuroscience. But I just remember, like, it has to be, like, a lot of tofu and over, like, a long period of time, like 10, 20 years. So.
Well, the other thing, too, is you can be vegan and still eat potato chips and cookies and
Right. Oh. be
you can
unhealthy,
still eat a
basically.
lot of junk food and be vegan. So it's not necessarily healthy just because it's vegan. So, and we don't really know the difference. It could be B12, it could be that they're not eating high quality food. But we don't really know. It could be. I still, Sleeper, anybody here know Woody Allen's Sleeper movie? Am I the only one? Okay, good. Yeah, the guy wakes up and smoking is good for you. So, who knows? They did. Absolutely.
And who paid for that study? Any
Well,
last questions?
Thank you. Yeah.
If a person is gluten intolerant, how would they make sure they get enough whole grain?
That's a really good question. And I am not sure I know the answer to that. I haven't seen, you can still have a lot of plants and vegetables and olive oil, yeah, and nuts. You can still have all of the good stuff. I don't know that whole grains necessarily, and actually the gluten intolerance, I could have a whole other conversation about that. But I think a lot of that is based on the refined flours. There are, one of my friends, and I don't know the data to this, and this is just an N of one, so it could be, she gets flour from Europe that is made differently, and it's not refined per se, and I don't really understand the difference, but she's gluten sensitive, it's not gluten intolerant, and she feels great, so.
Something about gluten-free is that oats are gluten-free, but they need to be made in a facility that does not also process wheat.
Right. I think the whole gluten thing is very complicated, and it's more than just bread, flour. I think it's very complicated, actually. But that's a good question. I still think you can get with seeds, you can still eat a lot of the seeds and legumes and that sort of thing that are healthy. I think you can get a really healthy Mediterranean diet even if you are gluten intolerant.
Brown rice considered a whole grain?
I don't know. Anybody know? Is brown rice a whole grain? Yes. Okay, good. Yeah. I eat a lot of that too. And yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Oh,
Florence.
you are very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out tonight and being in community. I know learning and science lowers my blood pressure after a long day at work. So I appreciate y'all coming out. We are here the first Wednesday of the month. Next month on March 6th, Dean Regas will be here talking about the total solar eclipse that's going to happen. He's going to share some stories from the past ones and make sure you're ready for the next one that's coming up. He's also going to have books to sign and the solar eclipse goggles if you need some of those. So be sure to come out for that. You can follow us on Facebook or on Meetup, Science on Tap Cincinnati. Big thank you to our partners, Radio Artifact, for their wonderful partnership in making all the tech work. All of our previous events are on their YouTube and Twitch channels. You can go out there and look at them. And if you're not able to join us one night in person, you can watch the live stream. So be sure to follow them as well. Thank you all for coming out. Have a safe trip home.